A few years ago, I made a couple of videos about identifying West German pottery, some of the tricks that might help, and they've had some success on YouTube. But in the last 3 years, a lot of new information has come to light. So it's time for an update, new information, and some corrections. One of the things to keep in mind is that the more this field is studied, the deeper and wider it turns out to be. If you go looking for a piece, you might not be looking through thousands of shape and decor combinations, but tens of thousands. There were over 100 companies that worked in this pop, retro, mid-century, modern style. That includes both West and East Germany. And that's not counting studio potters, which adds quite a bit more. So if you're not familiar with the field, you can easily get lost, or you can even decide not to start looking because you don't know where to start. And that's what this video is about. It gives you a starting point to work from so you feel a little less lost. It's not going to replace the other resources that are out there, the books, the CDs, and the websites. It may take all of them to identify some pieces. And some pieces, it seems no one knows yet who they made them. But if you know the questions to ask, you can at least narrow down some of the possibilities and give yourself a better chance. Now, even a lot of novices will be able to recognize this piece. Certainly, I can see it from across the room and know who made it. It's by Karstens in the Ankara decoration. But what if you don't know that? Or what if it's one of the many pieces that isn't as well known, isn't quite so distinctive? Where do you begin? You begin at the bottom. There are clues that, well, they don't always help, but they're a good starting point when you know the basics of identifying West German pottery. Okay, let's start with a look at some of the more common base types that you're going to find on West German pottery. You'll see completely blank, sometimes just a number and country designation, or sometimes you will be lucky enough to also get the company name spelled out. These are some of the more common clay colors that are used. Most companies used a white, off-white, or buff. Several use some shade of red, and there are some that used a dark brown clay. Now here's that blank bottom, or the oh crap, I don't know where to start bottom. But if it is West German pottery, the clay color at least tells you it's probably not Karstens. Sometimes you will find just the number designation, but number, clay color, and a Google search with the right keywords and patience will sometimes turn up something useful. This is probably the most commonly found base type, which gives you the shape number, size designation, and the country designation. But be careful. This Jasba item was made during the West German era, but it's only marked Germany. And there were times when several different companies did that. And sometimes lucky enough to have the name spelled out, as with this Bay ceramic piece. Or you may find a symbol, as with this Karstens vase. Let's not forget there was also a series of, well, rather distinct because they're so different from what everybody expects from West German pottery. These terracotta vases were made by Sawa, Iowa, Klinker Krupp, some other companies, and even Daimler and Bryden. Quite distinct from what they are better known for. Okay, now let us take a look at those numbers, what they mean. The first number, in this case 1268, is usually the shape or form, and it can be followed by a hyphen, a dash, a space, and then the next numbers are usually the size designation, approximate height in centimeters. This is 27. Notice the bar on the 7. You have to be very careful to tell the difference between the 1s and the 7s. And sometimes that second number is not exactly the height designation. Well, it's the height designation, but it is not the height in centimeters. It's a series designation. This may have become in 1, 2, 3, 4. The bigger the number, the bigger the piece. But this is West German pottery, so there are always complications and considerations. These two vases are the same shape, both from ES ceramic, but when you turn them over and look at the bottoms, you find two different shape numbers. That's because ES ceramic changed their number designations partway along. You'll also find companies reuse the same shape numbers on different shapes. Sharik used shape numbers sometimes 2, 3, 4, or 5 times. And remember that labels are not always the maker. They may be a retailer or a distributor, as you can see on this Huschenruther vase. Of the companies that used white clay, well, of all the companies, Sharik was far and away the largest producer. So that's quite often where you start a search, though it doesn't narrow things down much. This is a common Sharik base, also common from a number of other companies. But they used quite a variety of stylings. Here is the centered markings. And later, late 70s or into the 80s, Sharik did start to add the company name for a few years. Although later in this era, many of these have terrific glazes and are highly collectible items. And that is not true of this 3-circle mark, which Sharik started to use in the late 80s, at least in this embossed form. These tend to be lesser, and you shouldn't pay very much. Okay, now let's take a close look at this Bay base. A number of points I want to make. A lot of people have gotten the impression that Bay always marked their items, and that is simply not true. They did mark a fair number of them, but you'll find a lot of unmarked Bay. There's almost no West German company that marked all of their items. A few exceptions perhaps. Take a look at that Y, the lowercase or 2-line Y. I've said before, if it's white clay and a lowercase y, then Bay is where you start. And even without the company name, you would see that at the end of Germany. I do have to point out that there are several other companies that used white clay and the lowercase y, but they are lower production companies that you won't find as often. Now here we have a Daimler and Bryden mark, and they did mark quite a few of their items. Notice the D and B on the pommels as the pommels of the sword mark. On the other hand, notice that Daimler and Bryden quite often only used the Germany designation with no W or West, and particularly on later items, no company marking. And there are those rather distinctive Daimler and Bryden pieces. Very fascinating work, but it is quite different from what people have come to expect from West German pottery. Simply another sample of the variety. And this is a Russia base, a fairly early one. In this case, the clay is glazed over, but you will commonly find the written designations on the 1950s Russia pieces, which will often include an artist marking. This Russia piece, also from the 50s, you'll notice a reddish clay. Russia did sometimes use reddish clay early on, but sometimes that clay is only dirty or stained, so be careful. Now back to that item that's just the numbers. Well, that is also fairly common for Russia, particularly I would say into the 60s. And Russia, also in the 60s and into the 70s perhaps, commonly only used the series designation for their size. And it was later that Russia began to add the company name. Now these are not necessarily lesser pieces, some fantastic glazes, just later pieces. But be aware that Sharik did buy the rights to the names and some of the forms and glazes. And back to that blank bottom. Now, this is ES ceramic, and you can see why it has been rather difficult to attribute a lot of the ES ceramic pieces. On some of their finer glazes you will find an artist's mark, but the most common ES bottom is going to be with white clay and the numbers. Really doesn't give you much to go on. They did occasionally use a company mark, not often. On the other hand, Huschenruther may be the one company that marked all of their vases. Let us say I have yet to find an unmarked Huschenruther vase from this era. You have a lozenge mark with the HK, or the lozenge with the lion, and the, I believe, date the company was founded. Now this is an early Geppetto piece. Notice the fully spelled West Germany, which a number of companies seem to have done in the 50s, and the raised lozenge, rather distinctive. But this is Jasba from the same era. Notice that's the one that just says Germany. You can also see slightly there a gold ink stamp with Jasba in a circle, which was one of their early markings. By comparison, this is a later Jasba piece. You can see a faint impressed mark with Jasba in a circle. They did not mark everything. And the N designation, which is a very late piece. MR, you might guess Marzi and Remy. And even though there are other companies with those initials, in this case you'd be right. Although not much from Marzi and Remy is marked. And then you will find this strange mark, which turns out is also Marzi and Remy, although you will find some similar marks, oddly enough, from other companies. Now autoceramic. You would think that this would be a very unhelpful base, but Otto was one of the few companies that used a felt bottom like this. And if you go to all the trouble to remove that felt, here's what you find. Blank. But most Otto items are white clay and flat. This is a fairly common Schlossberg base. You can see on the label the TS or ST mark, which is sometimes impressed or incised on a few pieces. This is also a fairly common Schlossberg with the centered styling. But notice this. You would at first glance assume that these are from the same company. They are not. The left is attributed to Schlossberg. The one on the right has more recently been attributed to Geppetto. The only difference I can really note, well, several differences, but the one that seems to be consistent is that Schlossberg has more space between the upper and lower number. Otherwise, you will find variations between the two that are very similar. And this is a silver distal base. The white base, relatively small incised numbers, often rather sloppy, and usually fairly close to the edge. This is the earlier Stuhler mark, say up until 1960 or so. Notice red clay on the early piece. But much more commonly, you will find white clay, and when marked, this ST mark. Now we'll throw in one East German piece. This is Strela. You can't actually read the mark, but that's a very distinctive outline. You'll recognize it, or you should recognize it, every time. Well, this is a U-ceramic or Ubelacker base. The numbers, I believe, are actually impressed, but they quite often appear to be incised. So probably sometimes impressed, sometimes incised. most typically right up along the edge. And having that slash is fairly standard. I wouldn't say they did that all the time, but common. Now this one's a little sloppier, but it's still euceramic. Now, of the companies that used red clay, the one you will find most often is Karstens. This one has the Karstens 2 house mark. You can also see the TC worked into the design. Karstens marked a lot of items, but by no means all. You will find a wide variety of Karstens bases. Now this is actually a big deal here because up until recently this base would have been attributed to Roth ceramic, but it has been reattributed to Mirai ceramic. It seems that knowledge has kind of been hanging around for a while, but it was Kevin Graham who recently made it widely available to the collecting public. Notice the red clay. Mirai appears to have switched to red clay in the mid-60s. Having used white clay before, they used several different shades of red. Notice that swiped look on the glaze, also rather distinctive, as are the numbers. However, distinctive does not by any means mean that that's the way they always did it. And you will note, well, this one looks very similar, but notice the dark brown clay, the very clean look to the bottom, but still the same numbering style. This might be a somewhat later piece. This was also previously attributed to Roth. It's the bottom of one of the chimney vases, one of the better sculptural vases in West German pottery. But this one is also now attributed to Mirai ceramic. They have moved up significantly. And this is a typical Roth bottom. It was Roth, it is still Roth. You will find Roth with numbers, and the very well-known petal vases are also still attributed to Roth. Of the companies that used red or brown clay, the best is probably Serromano, and they really concentrated on quality over quantity. Gotta love a lot of their marking style because it's so complete. We have the shape designation, a size designation, Rustica, which is the decor name, Serromano company name, the country designation, and quite often you will find an artist's mark. These can sometimes be difficult to read and can be confused with Karuska, but Karuska was a much smaller company. On the other hand, you will also find Serromano pieces that are not nearly as well marked. This just has the shape number and the decor name, but it is Serromano. You'll find this kind of marking on smaller pieces and on later pieces from Serromano. Now this base has the full Serromano markings and these lines which actually tell you that this was a handmade piece, and that is a very good thing. Usually
Well, we've come to the end of the beginning, and that's really all this is. Just the merest start. I could do a video 2 or 3 hours long and it would still just be scratching the surface. There is so much to find, so much still that we don't know. The field's changing almost every day. That makes it exciting. It makes it confusing. But if you like adventure and quest, this is the field for you. Although I should warn you, it's also highly addictive. But at least you've got company. So good searching, good luck.